Hello everyone, this is Brad Maggard from maggardrazors.com. In this video, I will be explaining what regrinding is, how it's done, and some ways that certain razors might benefit from it. Before we get into the technical aspects of how it's done, we're going to examine some of the common problems that regrinding a blade can fix. So here's an example of an old wedge razor. A typical wedge has a very heavy grind. From the front, it looks something like this. The front and rear faces of these old wedge razors are usually very slightly hollow ground, but they were ground on very large wheels, sometimes a couple feet in diameter. For this reason, they appear as though they are perfectly flat on both sides to the untrained eye. But when you lay the razor on a hone, only the back of the spine and the edge of the blade will typically make contact with that stone. One common problem that we see is that over the years, repeated sharpening can grind down the spine of the razor, creating hone wear on the spine and a wide bevel at the edge. Let's look at some examples. This razor has a fair amount of hone wear, but it hasn't really become a serious problem yet. Notice how even the worn areas are from the shoulder of the razor all the way to the point. This means that it was honed using consistent pressure throughout the entire stroke on the hone, throughout the entire life of the razor. I certainly wouldn't recommend a regrind on a razor like this, but some people out there might still want it done simply for aesthetics. A lot of people like bright, shiny razors, and don't like the dark patina on the face of the blade. Here is another example, this time a little worse. You can see that the wear is relatively even, but the surfaces that touch the stones are much larger due to a lot of honing throughout the years. One downside of having a razor honed down so far is that honing takes a very long time, sometimes even a couple hours to establish an initial bevel. If that doesn't really bother you, then there's really no reason to take such a drastic measure as regrinding. Another reason I was swayed into keeping this razor as is the beautiful etch on the front face of the blade. The couple hours of honing were worth it to save it. Let's look at one more. This one has even more hone wear and took me nearly 3 hours to hone. Why didn't I regrind? Well, it certainly would have made honing easier, but sometimes it's just better to leave a razor as is. In this case, it was a rare 1830 to 1837 Wade and Butcher, and it had the original scales still intact. I wouldn't suggest a regrind on such an old, rare razor, especially when it is only for aesthetic reasons. To summarize, the lesson here is that heavy hone wear isn't always a big problem, and regrinding isn't always recommended. This is especially true for razors that have their original scales and have some collectible value. I try not to regrind anything pre-1850 because they are a lot less common to find and probably have more historical value as is. That said, plenty of guys like the idea of shaving with a shiny, clean, easy to hone vintage wedge, and for a blade with heavy hone wear and cracked scales, it's definitely an option. There are thousands of 1850 to 1890 Sheffield wedges out there, and many can be acquired for very little money. Let's move on to the next common problem, uneven hone wear, where things get a little more complicated. Here is where regrinding may be recommended for more than just looks. This first razor has some serious problems. You'll notice that the hone wear in the center of the blade is much wider than the wear near the heel and near the point. This could be caused by two things. The first possibility is that the person who honed this razor for years used a relatively narrow stone and didn't do strokes that evenly contacted the stone from heel to point. It is important to evenly hone, which is why the X stroke is taught by most shaving community members and old barbers' manuals. The other possibility, which is quite likely, is that the razor was originally ground uneven, probably made on a Monday or Friday, right? The problem with these sorts of wear patterns is that if you have learned to hone properly with consistent even strokes, you may very well have a rough time honing this blade. Varying amounts of surface area of the blade making contact with the stone throughout the stroke will create inconsistencies in the amount of steel removed at the edge at any given location. This next razor was sent to me specifically to correct the uneven hone wear by Regrind. Notice how at the point, the wear is much wider than at the heel of the blade? This is a very common occurrence on old razors. It's rather difficult to hone razors in this sort of condition. Moving on, our third common problem is pitting, corrosion, and rust. I lump these problems together because typically rust and corrosion are the causes of pitting. This is probably the most common problem that we find on old razors, because high carbon steel can rust very easily. Any razor that spent a few years in a garage or basement usually rusts. In order for a razor to be safe to use, any active rust must be removed. Beneath the old rust, there can be some very deep pits.
Check this one out. I don't care how much you like patina, it's clear that this razor simply is not safe to shave with. There's active rust all over it, and it is impossible to tell how deep it may go at first glance. This is definitely a candidate for regrinding. Another example with multiple issues is this old Greaves wedge. Here we see uneven hone wear and some pretty serious pitting. While the pitting is more an aesthetic issue, a regrind to fix the hone wear would be recommended, which will end up taking care of the pitting as well. Finally here, a very extreme example of pitting combined with heavy hone wear. Sometimes regrinding just makes sense on razors like this because it fixes so many issues all at once. So there you go, a brief description of the types of problems a regrind can fix. Now that we've seen some examples, let's talk about the process itself. In order to perform a regrind, some specialized tools need to be available. Ideally, a belt grinder with interchangeable wheels is used. These grinders come in different styles. Anything from units that look like fancy bench grinders to extravagant contraptions with all sorts of optional attachments to accommodate all sorts of different grinding jobs. On the high end, KMG and Bader are excellent grinders. Personally, I use a grinder that I built myself that is similar to a Bader's design.
The design is extremely versatile. It uses 2-inch by 72-inch belts, and I can configure it with an 8-inch contact wheel, a flat platen, a 4-inch contact wheel, and a slack belt configuration. Changing the belts is extremely easy. The procedure to regrind the face of a blade is relatively simple. First, a contact wheel must be chosen that has a tighter radius than what the blade was originally ground on. An 8-inch wheel is usually ideal for the average Sheffield wedge, although there are definitely times I wish I had a 10-inch or 12-inch wheel for those near true wedge razors. The larger the diameter of wheel, the heavier the resulting grind will be. The blade is held in such a way as the very center of the blade's face makes contact with the contact wheel. The blade must be drawn across the moving belt in a very even motion that comes with experience. Material is removed by the belt, and slowly the entire surface of the blade is ground down as evenly as possible until fresh steel can be seen from the edge of the razor all the way to the spine. The razor is then flipped and the other side is ground. In the process of doing this, pitting and hone wear are usually entirely removed. Another thing to note is that the geometry of the blade is never really altered. The spine is still the same thickness, and the blade remains the same width from top of spine to the edge. Therefore, the bevel angle will still be the same after a regrind. Let's look at the process from a different angle. These are examples of what happens at each stage of the regrind. Constant effort must be made to keep the grinding centered. A low grit belt, usually 40 or 60 grit, is used to remove the bulk of the material. As time goes on, the new hollow we are creating in the face will become wider and wider until eventually you will see fresh steel on the entire blade. It is important to stop before you actually get to the edge. If you grind into the edge with a 40 grit belt, let's just say you're going to have a bad time. After getting close, you progress to a higher grit belt, such as 80. You get a little closer to the edge with that belt, and so on through the grits. I usually go to around 1200 grit with my grinder. After I'm finished with the belts, I'll move to a buffing wheel. I typically start with some black emery compound to start, and then I'll move on to some white jeweler's rouge. After that, it's mostly hand polishing. The results from this entire process are usually pretty impressive. Blades that looked really bad with all sorts of problems can come out looking almost brand new. Have a look at some of these finished razors. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Also, check out my website.